Not because they're anything better. It's like caramel and honey, but apparently there's no beverages left.
Oh, well,
I lost my
I have
voice.
water, so.
Where would you like it? Where would you like to go?
Doesn't make a difference.
I.
She should be in the middle.
Yeah.
Closest. Oh, I should be in the middle.
Oh, sorry,
I
sorry.
was gonna say closest to the podium.
Okay.
But
Okay, I'm just gonna go here. Is that cool?
yes.
Just turning this off so there's no feedback.
Sorry, that's in the way.
Testing. 1, 2.
Yes, I feel like this
3,
is
4.
very,
Welcome everybody, I'm Mark Spicer, I'm the chair of the music department. This is a very special event celebrating the publication of Dr. Leah Batstone's book, Mahler and Nietzsche, Politics and Philosophy in the Horton Symphonies. So I'm here just to introduce our three distinguished panelists, and I'm going to let them talk to each other. Leah Batstone is a musicologist working at the intersections of art, music, politics, and philosophy in Central and Eastern Europe. She's published widely on composer Gustav Mahler, who's the topic of her first book, which she'll discuss today, as well as articles published in 19th Century Music, Journal of the Royal Music Association, and Music and Letters. She's also a scholar of music in Ukraine and is the founder and creative director of the annual Ukrainian Contemporary Music Festival in New York City. As a postdoctoral fellow in the Rewire program, a Marie Curie Actions project supported by the European Commission at the University of Vienna, she is currently working on her second monograph concerning musical modernism in Ukraine and a handbook to Ukraine's first woman composer, Stefania Turkevich. Did I say that right?
yeah, Turkish.
Turkevich, Symphony Number 1. From 2018 to 2021, she spent 3 wonderful years as an instructor in the Department of Music at Hunter College. We were lucky to have her. And I'm pleased to say that she will be returning to teach a seminar on black opera in the summer of 2024. So I'll introduce our other panelists. Randall Horton is a member of the board of the Gustav Mahler Society of New York. He is a composer, conductor, and arranger who worked as Duke Ellington's composing and conducting assistant. He also wrote music with members of the Jackson 5. We're going to have to talk about that later. And was mentored in conducting by Joseph Cripps, the musical director of the San Francisco Symphony from 1963 to 1970. Mr. Horton founded and directed the educational television project American Music. He is currently writing a dissertation on Mahler's 9th Symphony at SUNY Stony Brook, where he also teaches symphonic orchestral conducting and co-directs the Stony Brook Jazz Orchestra. Last but not least, Jeremy Glick is an associate professor, soon to be full professor, I think I can say that, of African diaspora literature and modern drama at Hunter, and the new editor of Situations, a journal of the radical imagination. He's currently working on long-form essays on Frantz Fanon, Sam Greenlee's Black Power detective fiction, and century methodological approaches to African American literature. His second book project is entitled Coriolanus Against Liberalism, Lumumba, and Pan-Africanist Loss. Professor Glick has recently received the Nicholas Guillen Philosophical Literature Prize for his 2016 book, The Black Radical Tragic. Please welcome our distinguished panelists, and thank you for coming.
I'm so small, I can't be seen around this giant computer. Okay, we'll try that. First of all, I just want to say thank you very much to the Gustav Mahler Society of New York and the Hunter Music Department for co-hosting this event. Both institutions are very special to me, and it's really an honor to be able to do this for the first time here at Hunter and with the co-sponsorship of the Mahler Society of New York. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the project, about the book, about sort of my methods, and then we'll have conversation, the three of us, and then we are willing to open it to the floor if there are any questions, comments from the audience. So, my interests as a musicologist have always been in the intersection of music and politics, how music is deeply linked to, reflects, and affects social change. For those of you who have taken my classes, you know this. In my own research, I have focused on symphonic music and its relationships with moments of political transformation, and that's the starting point for my book on Mahler and Nietzsche. Mahler lived in a time and place that I believe is a lot like the world we live in today. The established social order was starting to crumble with no certain sense of what would come next, at the same time that there were contributions from individuals across multiple cultures in a single space, in that case, Vienna. And that these contributions were accelerating innovation in every possible direction. Mahler, who pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable for the symphonic orchestra, moved in the same circles as individuals who would be responsible for establishing a new political system, namely social democracy in Austria, and introducing a modern era that included things like the right to vote, universal right to vote for men, and the 8-hour workday. The actions of these individuals came together around the writings of philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and among others. And given my own interest in Nietzsche's ideas, this is where I focus my research. In late 1891, Gustav Mahler wrote to his friend Emil Freund, "In the last few weeks, I have been reading something so remarkable and strange that it may very well have an epoch-making influence on my life." We know from other sources that what he was reading was Nietzsche. Mahler thought seriously about the philosopher's writings often, and although scholars have not ignored this relationship, Nietzsche's name appears frequently in writings about Mahler. Discussions of his influence have been previously examined within narrow boundaries, such as looking only at the fourth movement of the Third Symphony, which sets a Nietzsche text, or in service to other topics like broader aspects of something like German Romanticism or philosophy. That said, 2 books have been ostensibly written on the subject, but both proceed independent of any evidence of how Mahler understood Nietzsche. Eveline Nichols' O Mensch gib acht focuses largely on the 2 men as individuals and their compelling but mostly coincidental commonalities. Pathos, Parody, and Provocation by Albrecht Dammeier takes a different approach, eschewing all personal references and focusing instead on how Mahler's compositions can be viewed in terms of Nietzsche's philosophy of music, but not the very real engagements that Mahler had with Nietzsche's ideas. So therefore, I was unable to shake this emphasis on an epoch-making influence on my life. If Nietzsche's ideas had this level of impact on the composer, then understanding what Nietzsche meant to Mahler no doubt offered an important avenue for understanding the meaning of Mahler's music and elements of his musical style. And of course, connections between musical creation and important political changes in the 20th century, equally influenced by Nietzsche. In order to contribute to the heavily trodden Mahler discourse, I needed to create some framing for my investigations. One boundary of the so-called epoch seemed clear. Nearly all of Mahler's comments about and invocations of Nietzsche were concentrated in his music and correspondence prior to 1900. And in fact, after 1900, he experienced a number of life-changing events that have already led to a scholarly delineation of his music before and after these watershed moments. In In 1901, the composer suffered a near-fatal hemorrhage and came within an hour of bleeding to death. The same year, he met and began the courtship of his future wife, Alma Schindler, and they wed in 1902. More than a change in the presence of Nietzsche in Mahler's immediate orbit, the composer's musical style shifted following 1900. The first four symphonies are often grouped together under the heading of the Wunderhorn symphonies because each of the first four, and none of the symphonies after the fourth, use music that the composer is quoting from his own song cycles, mostly Das Knaben Wunderhorn, although others in that Wunderhorn style. So here I've outlined the quotations from each of the symphonies, what songs appear where. In addition, he also set the Midnight Song from Nietzsche's Thus Spoke Zarathustra in the Third Symphony, and for a short time, he considered giving the Third Symphony the title My Gay Science, Meine Fröhliche Wissenschaft, an explicit allusion to Nietzsche's The Gay Science. In 1896, furthermore, the composer referred to the finale of his Third Symphony by saying, "It is God, or if you like, the Übermensch." The Übermensch being a significant figure created by Nietzsche. During the period before 1900, he furthermore sent friends copies of Nietzsche's writings, and multiple recollections about the composer include descriptions of him enthusiastically discussing Nietzsche's ideas. So these clues to Mahler's engagement with Nietzsche largely disappear after 1900, making that a logical dividing point for my study. So hence, politics and philosophy in the Wunderhorn symphonies. The challenges to this project, and perhaps the reasons that such a study did not exist before the publication of this book, is that Mahler also made remarks that would seem to contradict his enthusiasm. Upon learning that his young wife was a fan of the philosopher, he instructed her to immediately throw her copies of Nietzsche into the fire. Some of the same individuals who recalled Mahler's zeal for Nietzsche also noted that the composer eventually moved away from the philosopher, particularly put off by the latter's turn against the composer Richard Wagner. It also cannot be ignored that the very scholars working in the so-called Mahler Renaissance of the 1960s would have been of a generation that saw Nietzsche as deeply tied to the ideology of National Socialists. And so when the philosopher is mentioned by these writers, it is often in a context where they are seeking to separate Mahler from Nietzsche. And for this reason, these complexities are heightened by Nietzsche's own notorious malleability to various worldviews. Nietzsche was read and appropriated by numerous 20th century movements, from anarchism to fascism. Mahler's peers, along with other early readers of Nietzsche, became the founders of socialist movements in Europe following the collapse of the region's empires. Yet German soldiers fighting in World War I went to the battlefield with copies of Thus Spoke Zarathustra in their pockets, and the Nazi philosopher Alfred Baumler helped to interpret Nietzsche's writings for the regime's notorious ends. For socialists, Nietzsche's rejection of the bourgeoisie and his call for personal authenticity were read as an endorsement of the value of all members of society. Capitalists and fascists, meanwhile, were attracted by Nietzsche's critique of democracy and his belief that the gifted should be encouraged to overcome all others in their pursuits. So, what became obvious was the need to understand what Nietzsche meant to Mahler and how that meaning could be observed in his music. At the end of the introduction to my book, I cite two conversations in which this crux on which my research would be built was laid bare. In 2011, when I started really digging into this project, I met with the Mahler scholar Morten Solvik in Vienna, and I was telling him about my interest in Mahler and in Nietzsche, and he stopped me and said, "But which Nietzsche?" 8 years later, Lou Smoley, president of the Gustav Mahler Society of New York, said to me something along the lines of, "Nietzsche is the kind of thinker with whom you must have a conversation. What you gain from his writings is equal parts what you bring to them." So what these conversations indicated was that studying Nietzsche in the music of Mahler was as much determining what Nietzsche meant to Mahler as how that was realized in Mahler's music. Given this situation, I decided to look at the reception of Nietzsche by those who introduced the composer to the philosopher's ideas and works. And these individuals, members of what was known as the Pernersdorfer Circle, are the subject of William McGrath's still seminal book from 1974, Dionysian Art and Populist Politics in Austria. So building from McGrath's study, I gathered a list of the most central members and those with whom Mahler had the greatest interactions. So for me, those were philosopher and poet Siegfried Liepinger, the founder of the Austrian Social Democrats, Victor Adler, writer and dramatist Richard von Kralik, member of parliament and journal editor Heinrich Engelbert Pernersdorfer, historian Heinrich Friedjung, and socialist politician Heinrich Braun and his wife Lily Braun. I then searched for documentation of their work, anything from manuscripts, photos, letters, and published essays, as well as secondary literature about any of them that might have been published but was not made widely available, particularly sources in German. And nearly all of these things were located in archives and libraries in Vienna. And so I spent 10 months looking at sources in half a dozen libraries around the city. This part of the project was generously funded by the Fulbright program, which allowed me to do this work for a full academic year as a scholar in Austria. During this time, I tracked down manuscripts, letters, out-of-print publications, meeting records, and even an article buried in the basement of Vienna's Central Hospital Library that outlined a particular but mostly consistent interpretation of Nietzschean ideas by Mahler's peers. The elements of this reading overlapped with Mahler's own invocations of Nietzsche in some central ways, and these served as the basis for the chapters of my book. So what emerged was a reading of Nietzsche with several particular components. These components could be aligned with the composer's repeated compositional choices that allow us to see an engagement with Nietzsche that is sustained throughout his early works. Each of these choices is the subject of a chapter in the book that, when taken together, I believe makes a powerful case for Nietzsche's influence on Mahler's music. The chapters are organized around a few of the direct quotations of Nietzschean ideas found in Mahler's writings and considers their reception within a gradually expanding sphere of influence of Mahler's peers, beginning with members of the Pernersdorfer circle and moving beyond the circle to broader receptions of Nietzsche within fin de siècle Vienna. So in the first chapter, I explore the use of drama, in particular, a kind of dramatic combination of narrative and self-nullifying emotional power that Nietzsche aligns with the ancient Greek figures of Apollo and Dionysus, respectively. And I do this in part through a study of Wagner's writings. So Wagner being a significant figure of influence for both Mahler and Nietzsche also explores this idea of tragedy, even though Nietzsche is the person largely credited with it. And I do this partly as a way to acknowledge the Wagnerian component of this relationship, but also to sort of clear the way for things that I find in Mahler's music that are distinctly Nietzschean. So you could make the argument that some of these dramatic elements might have a Wagnerian root, and that's fine, and that works, and that is also aligned with Mahler's reading of Nietzsche, but it sort of clears the space for the preceding chapters, which then are sort of distinctly about Nietzschean ideas. So the second chapter explores the role of humor, particularly the juxtaposition of tragic and comic. This comes from Mahler's own invocation of the term tetralogy. He refers to his first four symphonies, which, as I've already mentioned, are themselves bookended by scholars as a perfectly self-contained tetralogy. And that's often been allied with Wagner, except that Wagner's tetralogy is a very different kind of tetralogy to what we find, I think, in Mahler, and actually what Nietzsche describes in the tetralogies of ancient Greece, wherein the final component, the final quarter of the tetralogy is actually lighthearted and humorous, and meant to kind of inspire us to sort of keep living, even though we've seen the tragedies of the preceding three stories. We're inspired to keep going, sort of comedy in the face of horror. And this redemptive combination is actually something that we find also in the writings of Mahler's peers. Liepinger talks about it as being an especially powerful element of ancient Greek literature. Kralik uses a similar juxtaposition in some of his dramas, so much so that it's even observed by critics. So here we have sort of the starting point of a distinctly Nietzschean engagement, which is not a Wagnerian engagement. The third chapter examines Mahler's use of various and simultaneous voices through his one-time working title for the Third Symphony, My Gay Science. So the gay science as a work, one of the things that it advocates for is a kind of objectivity through perspectivism. The idea that we can only see sort of the greatest approximation of what is objective with as many perspectives as possible. You know, you can't sort of look at everything with a single eye. You have to have as many sort of perspectives as possible, and that's the closest you're ever going to get to approximating a kind of objective view. And Mahler's use of multiple voices, which is something a lot of scholars have talked about, kind of realizes that you have these, you know, colliding perspectives. Sometimes they are in conflict with one another, but sometimes they're just sort of running into each other in Mahler's music. And that was something that, you know, critics were sort of very disturbed by in Mahler's day, but is definitely a kind of representation of the value of these multiple perspectives coming together, even if they're not in agreement or even in dialogue. This is, of course, also an idea that was pioneered by the Austrian Social Democrats, who prided themselves on a diversity of perspectives in representing as many of their constituents as possible, and in particular were very proud of the fact that their constituency was a very multi-ethnic constituency. And in fact, there was this little joke about how the Austrian International was its own little international within the greater Socialist International because it had so many different ethnicities, languages, traditions, cultures. And of course, the Habsburg Empire was, at its height, huge and contained a multitude of ethnic groups and languages and religions. The fourth chapter deals with this characterization of Mahler's Übermensch, or Mahler's characterization of Nietzsche's Übermensch, and an investigation into kind of what the equivocation of God with the Übermensch means. So not only does he equate these two things, but he repeatedly conceives of sort of the act of self-overcoming as something that is in benevolent and divine terms, not only in how he writes about it, but also in his musical treatment. So many of Mahler's symphonies end with big chorales, voiceless or not voiceless. There's a very kind of religious component to this treatment of self-overcoming. And so this equation of God and the Übermensch is not a judgment on God, it's a judgment, I think, on the Übermensch's ability to be a spiritual-like figure. This is also something that appears in the thinking around a lot of proximal groups in Mahler's world. So his colleagues talk about the religious aspects of the Übermensch. In drama, in politics, Lilly and Heinrich Braun are quite insistent that the best kind of socialist is a socialist that encourages the individual of each member, the individuality of each member, so that we can all sort of be our best selves and work together towards bettering the community for everyone. This is also a reading that can be found in the writings of Jewish thinkers at this time. So Theodor Herzl and Martin Buber both talk about the Übermensch in these kind of semi-spiritual terms. So this is an idea that's sort of floating around and it's not limited to Mahler. And then the fifth and final chapter, I explore some of the ways in which Mahler and Nietzsche sort of diverge and how those elements appear in Mahler's works after 1900. But I also reflect on the elements of the later symphonies that can be seen as maintaining a kind of continuity with these early elements of the early symphonies. And I consider some of the scholarship that has actually argued for the influence of Nietzsche being one that extends across Mahler's career and isn't just concentrated in any particular time period. So ultimately, what I suggest is that a lot of the characteristics that we've come to see as defining Mahler's music, both for scholars and for audiences, can actually be traced to the early influence of Nietzschean ideas on the composer. And not only, but I think that there's compelling evidence for things like colliding perspectives, programmatic descriptions that aren't quite programmatic, these redemptive finales, self-quotation, all of these things, which are very sort of Mahlerian in our conception of the composer, are things that can be connected, at least in part, to his reading of Nietzsche. As a through line to my ongoing research and the subjects I gravitate towards in my teaching, one additional outcome of this research has been to realize that Mahler is not, as he's sometimes depicted, an alienated genius whose complex identity of Jewish, Bohemian, and Austrian left him as an outsider in Vienna, but rather that those experiences of mixed identities proliferated amongst his peers and contributed both to their politics and, I think, to the innovations that they pioneered. So all of the members of the circle that I mentioned had a kind of mixed background. Many of them were Jewish. All of them came from outside of Vienna, from areas of the Crown lands. And I think that this experience of kind of multi-ethnic, multiple identities influenced their reading of Nietzsche. How could it not, right? How could it not influence their reading of anything if that was sort of who you were in Vienna in the fin de siècle? And I explore this less in the book and more in my article on 19th century music, but it is something that kind of emerged as I was working on these figures. And so I think, the power of the theatrical to be harnessed both for political gain as well as in the concert hall, especially in the service of securing things like universal suffrage for men and the 8-hour workday. I think the redemptive character of tragedy, as well as this benevolent idea of the Übermensch, is a reading that might come more easily to groups that were kept outside of the center of society in some way. And as I mentioned, many Jews and Slavic groups also tended towards similar readings of some of these aspects of Nietzsche. As I mentioned, perspectivism is almost by definition something that someone who had a variety of perspectives would maybe appreciate more than someone who was a Austrian Christian person who grew up in Vienna and was kind of always within the inside of society. So their experiences tied unquestionably to their identities influenced their reading of Nietzsche, but also a broader worldview and perhaps a means of seeing things differently and therefore being capable of certain kinds of innovation. So this is generally sparked by interest in minority contributions and questioning the presumed flow of innovation from center to periphery, and in the richness of culture that results from artistic production in multicultural spaces. So those are some introductory comments. I'm very happy to answer questions about any aspect of the book in more detail. A little bit hard to get a whole book into a 30-minute summary, but I just wanted to lay the groundwork for those who may not have read it yet, and I'm excited to have a discussion now with my two interlocutors. So, thank you.
Bravo.
Okay. Thank you, guys. It's very nice to meet you and to see Leah. This book is incredible. What I did here, I brought some books, and I was going to bring more, but then I would feel like a crazy person on the train. This book is incredible in a way that extremely urgent and important studies have their own sort of dialectical clashing movement. What I mean by that is it demands for readers and audiences to go deep inside the weeds of its topic, but also proliferate outside with numerous associations and tangents and sort of sidewinding roads that is inspired by the serious work here. I also think that, Adorno has this punchy epigraph in Minima Moralia that a lot of post-colonial lit scholars pick up on, where he says, in order to, one has to have tradition in oneself in order to hate it properly. And I think that I'm not going to get into this now, but I think that the kind of continuity, the kind of like deep, serious thought in terms of the intersections of philosophy and symphonic music and Mahler, that historical memory or the lack of that historical memory is, I think, is one of the reasons, or is related to why we're in the kind of mess that we're in this country. So I think that there's something extremely defiant about Leah's, Mahler's, Nietzsche that goes against the grain of, what Gore Vidal famously called the United States of amnesia. So let me just talk about the three ways in which I think about this. And let me say also, it was funny when Leah asked me to do this, Deutsche Grammophon were really revving up their reissue campaign of like some of their really, really wonderful recordings. So between like getting those records and like taking seriously your claims here, I feel like I've learned so much. So let me just quickly go through. I organized my remarks, I'm going to read you some things, around three questions. Questions of form, questions of affect and immunity, and questions of politics. So in terms of the questions of form, there's some really wonderful moments. They're a little maybe arbitrary. It's based on what I really was interested in. But Leah talks about how, I believe this is on page 4. She talks about how there's this conflict between, or a supposed conflict between Nietzsche's aphoristic writing and Mahler as a master of symphonic form. And you get out of that very quickly by saying, well, the works that Mahler dug from Nietzsche weren't the aphoristic ones. But I really wanted to like stay there for a second and kind of do a counterintuitive or a speculative thing, but like, well, what if it was the aphoristic? Because it gets at the kind of dialectical tension that I think you develop all throughout the text. The other thing I should say is, I always found in my studies that there's this really interesting thing where people with who are interested in dialectical materialism or Marxism writ large, they have a thing for Wagner and detective fiction. So I'm a scholar. I did my PhD in African American literature. I've written on Mozart as it relates Don Giovanni to a C.L.R. James play on the Haitian Revolution. I write a lot about Mingus and repetition. But I learned a lot from Leah. This is by no means my field. But I have read a lot of Wagner and Wagner studies. And I really am appreciative of this text I had never read the Beethoven work, Wagner's Beethoven work. And I thought that was really interesting, the work Leah does with that. Okay, so I wanted to, that question of the aphoristic and the master of the symphonic form. And then while Leah was talking, this tetralogy, the whole 3 sad and 1 satyr, hopeful, transcendence in the face of that 3 sad. It struck me that it's interesting that, in Nietzsche's work and in Mahler's, sort of in this encounter between Mahler and Nietzsche that Leah stages, there's, instead of negation, there's often this tetralogy, and that it's interesting that instead of a philosophical procedure of negation that would look at the sad and come through that out somewhere more hopeful, you get actually a form, the 3 tragedies and the satyr. So instead of a philosophical posture or what Brecht would call a Haltung, a stance, you get a kind of proliferation of forms. And that related to me about this text that we've briefly discussed. Frederick Jameson wrote this incredible text called Allegory and Ideology. And there's this incredible essay within this text about the Mahler's 6th Symphony. And Jameson talks about this sort of this synthesis in Mahler between what he calls the melodramatic gesture and micrological simultaneity. And I just was curious about what you thought about that. And I'll just wrap up really quickly with just a little more left field stuff. Leah doesn't talk about Dostoevsky or Schopenhauer, but for some reason, and obviously Adorno is the Frankfurt School guy that is, lying, in the rafters here. But I thought of this very famous dialogue because of Nietzsche specifically between Benjamin and Brecht. It's the Swedenborg dialogues. And there's this moment where Benjamin writes that Brecht thinks that Chopin and Dostoevsky have particular adverse effects on people's health. I cannot listen to Chopin or read too much Dostoevsky. it messes with my immune system. And I was thinking about that in relation to this kind of genealogy that Leah creates, because I was like, okay, well, if Nietzsche could hear that, he wouldn't necessarily like the, and obviously this is totally speculative, the judgment on Schopenhauer or his sort of future inheritance, Dostoevsky, but he would dig the fact that Brecht was linking the aesthetic and the interpretive reading experience to something that happens to him physiologically. It lowers his immune system. And then finally, I feel like the expectation was that I was going to say something about Nietzsche and radical politics. There is the 1954, I love Lukács. I do not recommend this book though. The Destruction of Reason, where he goes into this whole, very, very long-winded discussion of Nietzsche as a sort of forebearer of fascism and irrationalism. There's a shorter version of that argument that I'd like to plug. You can get it online for free. Lukács wrote in Russian in a literary encyclopedia this great 15-page 1934 essay just called Nietzsche. And I also just wanted to plug, because we were talking about Turin as it relates to Nietzsche, as it relates to things that you and your colleagues are doing. The Domenico Losordo text, Nietzsche, the Aristocratic Rebel, Intellectual Biography and a Critical Balance Sheet, was published initially in 2002 in Italian in Turin, and it's like 5,000 pages. Haymarket, in the last couple of years, recently published it in English, and it's a really good kind of way of creating that critical balance in terms of Nietzsche's politics. So that's where I went. Questions of form, questions of affect and immunity, and questions of politics. And, I should say that, mediation is a complicated thing, but I think that the fact that there are less of these kind of books being written, I think could be attributed to the trouble we're in. So I congratulate my colleague and friend for a brilliant antidote to our collective states of amnesia.
Bravo.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, wow. A lot of things to think about and respond to. I mean, in terms of the aphoristic, yes. So you were absolutely correct that I sort of quickly sidestepped that argument by pointing out that a lot of the texts that Mahler engaged most with were not the aphoristic texts. I don't actually think, though, that that's necessarily a conflict between Mahler and Nietzsche. It would be very hard to describe anything in Mahler's music as aphoristic, but I think that there are these sort of seeds, musical seeds in his music that are very powerful in and of themselves, and in that way are perhaps like aphorisms. And he, of course, explodes these things into these hour-long symphonies and massive orchestras, but that isn't necessary. It's certainly not necessary for all of Mahler's music, and sometimes I think that what it's at the very heart of the music that can be so affecting is actually very small-scale things. I did not go down that road in the book because I think it's maybe a separate discussion, but I don't think that those two things are at odds. And I think it may have been, as I mentioned, there was definitely a push to kind of separate Mahler from Nietzsche, I think, in the minds of people who very much saw Nietzsche as being allied with certain politics that they did not want Mahler to be allied with. And so I think there may have been some creativity going on in terms of looking for ways of saying, well, listen, these people were very different. And Mahler, for instance, some of the things I talk about as being central elements of the later symphonies that are not sort of Nietzschean were the role of romantic love, certainly the role, to some extent, of spirituality. I mean, these are things that don't line up so well with Nietzsche. I suppose I would say to that, you don't need to take everything on board from an influence to be influenced by them. And so it's enough that there were some things that Mahler clearly took. And I hope that this book kind of tries I hope that this book shows a little bit of what those things are, or how we might think about how that influence affected Mahler. Questions of affect. Well, I was thinking about how Mahler has made a lot of appearances recently in the movies. Maestro, of course, Mahler, any of you have seen Maestro, there's this quite long scene of Bradley Cooper conducting the end of the Second Symphony. Mahler played a big role in the film Tar. It does seem like Mahler, the affect that Mahler is having, at least in the current culture, is not one of, hurting people's immune systems, but rather one that I think is more sort of in line with this actually Nietzschean kind of overcoming. There's this intense sort of emotional component and this ability to sort of take in everything. I mean, some of the music can be just so beautiful that it's painful, but also kind of to make peace with that pain and to be better for it. And I think that is very much a kind of Nietzschean idea, but also a very Mahlerian idea. And like I said, it seems to be sort of the role Mahler is playing at the moment in terms of sort of broader pop culture. And of course, Mahler's role in pop culture and his reception by sort of general audiences has changed quite a lot. And for a long time, his music wasn't played at all. And then, there were some films about him which were quite strange and sort of. I think his identity has changed, and I would say the one that has sort of is proliferating now is one that I see as being in line to some extent with elements of his music that I find to be Nietzschean. Politics.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was just, anyway, I want to hear it. I just thought like the Lukács, the Destruction of Reason, I thought it was 1954, and then I was like, well, this is after the war, and then I thought it was just interesting to find out that he had written something in 34, and that there's a similar argument, but and then the Lacerda, it just seemed so perfect to line up. So I was just gesturing to things that people could look at if they wanted to try to figure out how to square that circle.
I mean, it is really, I think, important, and I hope I made this clear when I sort of talked about how I got engaged in this project, that Nietzsche is so complicated because he is so multifaceted. And it's, as much as I saw a kind of continuity in the reading of Nietzsche amongst Mahler's peers, and I've connected that to elements of Mahler's music, and I stand very firmly behind that interpretation, I'm by no means making the claim that that is Nietzsche. I mean, that was Nietzsche, in my opinion, for these people. And Nietzsche can be a lot of things, and Nietzsche certainly has been a lot of things, my personal feelings about Nietzsche aside. But I think that has been a huge challenge, and one of the reasons why a book like this hasn't been written, because what Nietzsche, right? Which Nietzsche? This is the question that Morten Solveig asked me, and it's true, and especially in the 20th century. I mean, before the National Socialists kind of really laid claim to Nietzsche's ideas, which I think has taken a long time to undo, and Walter Kaufmann's work has been seminal in undoing that. I mean, anarchists, feminists, capitalists, fascists, I mean, everybody was claiming Nietzsche. And so it was just really difficult to sort of say what Nietzsche was, and therefore to understand what could a quotation from Thus Spoke Zarathustra mean. Is this Zarathustra the blonde beast, the Übermensch, who's like crushing people to reach the pinnacle of achievement? Or is this a kind of benevolent Zarathustra who comes down from the mountain, even though he doesn't have to, and wants to spread his wisdom, and is kind of a Christ-like figure? And of course, Nietzsche's father was a preacher, and so those references are very purposeful. So I'm not surprised that there are these other interpretations, both pre and post-war, and I think it is all part of sort of understanding Nietzsche's writings and confronting both the things that I have find very inspiring in Nietzsche's writings, but also the things that are not so inspiring and that are kind of hard to swallow. And to realize that Mahler and his peers will have been doing the same thing, and they will have taken on some things and not others. So.
I don't belong here.
That's not true.
No, it is true. And I told Leah that very thing, and she said, well, I want you to be there. Why? Because there very well might be several young people from our student body, from Hunter College's student body, who know nothing about Mahler or Nietzsche or even classical music. They know a lot about the music that they love, like hip hop, R&B, and they probably would be more attentive to someone like yourself, Randall, who is just beginning to study Mahler, and that's an emphasis.
Not my emphasis, by the way. I didn't say beginning.
Okay, it's my emphasis. Now, she did not say I was beginning, no. I'm in a PhD program at Stony Brook University because of my Mahler studies. And I'm honored to be here. The president of the Gustav Mahler Society of New York, who's here in the audience, Mr. Lou Smoley, brought me into the society and has even appointed me to serve as the treasurer of the society. So it's not that I'm a beginner in that sense, because my love is there for the composer. And I'm going to get into that in just a moment. But that, if anything, would be the reason why one could say I'm justified in sitting here today. What happened was that when I first met Maestro, Mr. Smoley, I proposed an article that I had written that discussed an aspect of the last movement of his last completed work, Mahler's last completed symphony, the ninth. So that's where I'm going to start. And it doesn't really connect, I don't think, with the brilliance that I've been hearing, and I want to get up and go home right now. But I won't do that because it's rude. So what I'm going to do now is just to give a bit of a background on what led me to the Mahler Society and to my emphasis on working with his music, his Ninth Symphony, especially the last movement, when I applied to the PhD, the master's program, at Stony Brook University. I told them that it's Mahler that I'm interested in. Now, that's where I'll start. Joseph Cripps was the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony when I was first really introduced to symphonic conducting. He looked at me very intensely after I had been sent to him, and he told me, "Yeah, you come. You sit 5 rows back." And I sat and I listened to the orchestra rehearse, first under Maestro Cripps, and then under Seiji Ozawa, who just died, by the way, and then Herbert Brumstead and others. And that's where I learned how to conduct. Yes, I got instruction, but I observed those masters. Ozawa from 1970 to 1976. I went to nearly every one of his rehearsals and sat close to him as he was rehearsing. And then I was given privilege to attend his concerts free of charge. That's how I learned how to conduct, through observing. Mahler was a part of that experience. So that's how I got started. And I was in a school in San Francisco studying under a composer who became my mentor, Kirk Meacham. And then I got called by Duke Ellington. And Maestro Ellington brought me into his orchestra. That was by audition also, but it was like a miracle, I'd have to say. And so he brought me into his orchestra as his composing and conducting assistant. So I had to leave school. I had to quit school. I mean, you would quit school if Ellington brought you into his orchestra. Trust me. So that's what happened. And I was to replace Billy Strayhorn. Well, where did that end up? It ended up in January of 2022, many decades after Duke had appointed me. I'm sorry. And in January 22, the 26th of January, the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra flew from London to Orlando, Florida, to perform a week's worth of performances. Different pieces, gorgeous. One of the pieces was my concerto grosso orchestration of Maestro Ellington's tone poem, Black, Brown, and Beige. And I set it in such a way that I brought Mahalia Jackson's singing, because she had recorded music that belonged to Black, Brown, and Beige in the 1956 or 58, one of those years, album that was entitled Black, Brown, and Beige, where she recorded and Maestro Ellington and the band played. Well, Mahalia Jackson improvised two pieces. One was called Come Sunday, which has become a staple of the church canon, and one was called the 23rd Psalm. So she recorded those. It's glorious, beautiful. So what I was told to do by Mercer Ellington, Duke's son, was to convert Black, Brown, and Beige into concerto grosso. And what had happened over the years, that piece, especially in the third movement, Beige, was trashed. I won't mention the critics who trashed it, but they did trash it. And what happened was that as I was researching and trying to figure out what to do with the piece, the third movement, which had been trashed, came to me in such a way that it opened up the door for me to set those two musical compositions, Come Sunday, that Mahalia Jackson had sung, and the one that she improvised, the 23rd Psalm, set those into the third movement. And of course, I had a full symphony orchestra to write for, so I orchestrated it. And you know what happened? That experience completed the meaning of Black, Brown, and Beige. That's all I'll say about it, because this talk is not about my experience with Ellington. But I do want to say that that happened. So now, how did this lead to Mahler? What is that all about? Well, what happened was that I was an intern at the American Composers Orchestra here in New York. And I was scheduled to concertize his sacred music because I'm privileged to have been the person who has performed his sacred music more than anybody else in the world, including Ellington. So I was at the American Composers Orchestra as an intern, planning to produce a concert in Manhattan with the Juilliard Jazz Orchestra, singers and dancers, music, the sacred music of Duke Ellington. So I did that, and it was a blessing. It was a real blessing. But what happened in the meantime was that's how I connected with Mahler. Because what happened was that Gustav Mahler's music was being performed at Carnegie Hall. And I was leading the sacred music. And long story short, my leading of that led me to the performance that the Philadelphia Orchestra was presenting at Carnegie Hall of Gustav Mahler's Ninth Symphony. So, one thing led to another. I won't go into too much detail. But as it turned out, I got to go to that concert at Carnegie Hall where the Ninth Symphony was being performed. And don't you know what was being performed also? The fourth movement of that work, of the Ninth Symphony, includes music that I had been performing for 40 years in the church. A piece of the hymn, Abide With Me, in the last movement. What I heard was, dum, 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 and something like da, 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 whatever the rest of that introductory phrase was. I heard it 6 different times in the fourth movement of Mahler's Ninth Symphony. I didn't know why I was hearing that, but I also did not know that no one else had analyzed that presence and that it was not discovered. It was performed first in 1912 under Bruno Walter, who was the conductor of the Columbia Symphony in New York. And as it turned out, my conducting mentor, Dennis D. Coteau, was a violist in his orchestra. So I'm connected in a way. But what happened was that when I went back to the place where I was having sessions and meetings with the organization that was sponsoring me, I learned that no one ever had discovered the full context of that hymn. I said the full context of that hymn in the last movement of that Ninth Symphony. It was premiered by Walter in 1912. I heard it in 2009, was it? No, 2005. And I researched and researched and researched. No one had written an analysis, a real analysis of the full presence, the strophic presence, the full presence of that hymn. Not just the first four notes. No. The melody of that hymn is embedded beneath the structure and beneath the fourth movement in such a way that you can only hear the first 4 notes. And then the rest of the hymn is buried. You've got to go searching for it. And so that's what I spent 7 years doing, including through Schenkerian analysis, through my professors at the Graduate Center here in CUNY. There's some wonderful Schenkerians there. And I analyzed and analyzed and analyzed, and there it was. So I thank Mr. Smoley, president of the Gustav Mahler Society, because I told him what I had discovered, and I wrote an article. The name of the article was, I can't remember the name of the article. Sorry. But Mr. Smoley published the article. And there it was. So I hope that you don't mind that I'm going to do a little singing And Leah, this doesn't connect directly with what we discussed, but I can only offer what I have. This is all I can give. I can talk about my experiences with the Jackson 5, but I don't see any young people in this audience here, okay? I see maybe one or two. But working with Michael Jackson and his brothers and all that was a dream. It was great, yes, yes, yes. But we're talking about Mahler. Working with Ellington, like I said, my orchestration of his Background in Beige, the Royal Philharmonic, performing my orchestration with Jazz at Lincoln Center Big Band in Orlando, Florida. Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. But that still isn't Mahler. So this is the melody of that hymn, Abide With Me. I'm going to sing the words. Please bear with me. Remembering that Mahler was rebuked because he was a Jew, remembering that Mahler was rebuked, his last sentence, a Jew throughout the world. I'm thrice rejected. And the third aspect of that rejection was as a Jew throughout the world. I have compassion in that context. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood, and I worked in synagogues, and I have great compassion for that history. So he was rebuked and he was rejected because he was a Jew. He went through hell in Vienna, in America. So he kept his faith to himself. And in his last completed work, before his death, he buried this hymn so nobody else would know he did it. It was premiered in 1912 by Bruno Walter with the Vienna Philharmonic, but Mahler had died already. And I discovered it in 2007, and Mr. Smoley did the gracious move to publish it in 2012. So it's 100 years. 100 years. Abide with me. Fast falls the eventide. Now this is about death. But he didn't want anybody to know that this is what he was feeling and singing. The darkness deepens. Lord, with me abide. When other helpers fail and comforts flee, help of the helpless, oh, abide with me. Now, that's the full strophic presence of the melody. One stanza only. That happens 6 times. It's buried. Oh well, maybe you won't get to hear it, and I won't waste your time. I have it on my website, recorded 6 different times, where the full melody of the hymn, strophically speaking, those opening 4 notes, or maybe 6 notes, that you can hear, are then buried underneath the texture of the rest of the presence of the hymn. You can't hear it unless you know what to do to listen to it. I had been a church musician for 40 years. I probably had performed that piece, that hymn, 300 times. So I heard it. When I was at that Carnegie Hall performance, I heard those first 4 notes, but then I listened intently, and the rest of the hymn was present underneath everything else. It was in the texture of the last movement. And that happens 6 different times. So I'll leave it. Leah, I apologize to you because I still say I don't belong here. And what I mean by that is that I haven't read enough and I haven't studied enough. I've read much of your book and I love it. I don't know Nietzsche. I'm sorry, I don't. I love what I'm reading in your book. I absolutely do. I've loved the meetings that we've had, where you've explained to me the relationship between Nietzsche and Mahler, and I read it in the book. But folks, that's all I can say. Thank you.
Well, I'm actually glad that you shared all of that in detail, because I think it does speak to one of the things that I identify in Mahler's finales, and is actually something that, while I'm talking about it mostly in the Wunderhorn symphonies and the finales of the first four symphonies, this religious, sort of redemptive call for divine abidance, assistance, uplifting. This is something that appears also in the later symphonies. This is something that I think stays in Mahler. And the fact that in the third symphony, he's making this equation of the finale of being religious, of symbolizing God, and also the Übermensch. I think this just shows the way in which this stays with Mahler. Not only these kind of religious finales, that here we have the finale of the last symphony that he completed. Again, this hidden hymn with this redemptive message to it, but that's something that actually starts way back in these early symphonies. Yes. And can be connected to yes. his reading of Nietzsche. Okay. So I feel like in a way this is sort of validated my the claim that, or the discussion that I have in the last chapter, which is that, you know, this influence of Nietzsche, this particular reading of Nietzsche, is something that really came to define Mahler's style in and of himself. I mean, the things that we identify as being Mahler are things that I think there's at least an argument for originating in his reading of Nietzsche, in this particular reading of Nietzsche that's a redemptive one to some extent.
I do recall reading when he was being questioned about his resources for creating texts for the Resurrection Symphony. And I do remember reading, I think it was in the Mahler Companion, the text, that he must have a resource that is textual, that are words, before he can really compose a long, extended composition. And myself being, like I said, 40 years in the church, 11 different denominations. What does that mean? And then in the synagogue, studying with ministers as I would prepare church services, or with in synagogues, those leaders. What I remember him saying is that I have to have texts before I can write an extended work. And what I discovered in that Resurrection Symphony, well, first of all, it didn't mean what I thought. Resurrection, no, that's not, what I thought. Oh, resurrection, I'm a Christian. Oh, no, nah. What he did was that he changed the meaning of resurrection. He changed the texts, totally changed the text. That was a revelation to me, and that brought me closer to him. Because he's saying that it's really love. It's love that creates what I would call salvation, not he, but I. But it's about love, and then he just goes on and on, speaking about the power of love. And Liebhiner and he were, is the word iconoclastic? But they were rebuking the doctrines of the church and of synagogues. They rebuked all of that, and they came up with their own doctrines.
As did Nietzsche. I mean, Nietzsche also is this figure that's sort of, certainly creating his own doctrines, and doctrines that are more or less bound to elements of the church. I mean, Nietzsche was the son of a preacher. I mean, he grew up steeped in that tradition, and he references it, he uses it. It's something that, you know, he didn't just turn away from. So as much as he says God is dead, he's still drawing on this very deep well of spirituality, but sort of remaking it in his own view. And yeah, I think Mahler and Liebner are doing sort of similar things, and they are the more artistic of the group. But I think all of them are sort of taking these ideas that were in the air and sort of rethinking how can these things be reimagined in a way that, you know, creates a more equitable society, that creates a new form of drama, that creates a new version of religion. I mean, any of these elements that were all kind of, it was part of what all of them were kind of looking at and was kind of part of the era.
I love what Caroline Keita did in her dissertation, first of all. And she was at the Mahler Society. I've seen a picture of her with Mr. Smoley, you know, in one of our programs. But she came and I didn't get to see that. I really regret that I didn't see that. But she was there. I've seen her picture with some of the leadership there. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that in her book, which I have here, which was an outgrowth of her dissertation, she makes a strong point of the idea of compassion in the Jewish sensibility. Understanding what compassion means. You are not able to serve others and to love others, or even love yourself, unless you have compassion for the suffering of others. And she's just been a wonderful help to me. You know, anytime I ask her for help, she's there. You know, she's a wonderful person. Wonderful. I know you know her well.
Yeah, she and I have talked about a lot of these ideas as well. And of course, many of the, as I pointed out, many of the members of the Partner Circle were Jewish. So Liebner and Mahler both convert to Christianity. Not everyone does, but this is definitely sort of, again, I think for me, one of the things that was important about this project was sort of seeing Mahler in a context that he isn't always portrayed in, which is, you know, we do love these stories of sort of great isolated geniuses who suffer alone. And I'm sure, you know, I know Mahler certainly suffered. And alone, I'm sure, some of the time. But the idea of his particular experience as being one that, you know, meant he was alienated in Fantasy society is actually not sort of the case. And he's part of this whole group of thinkers who have similar mixed backgrounds that lead them to similar sort of spaces in terms of their ideas and consequently the innovations that they contributed to that society.
I remember,
Yeah, I was just,
I remember that I went to a performance of one of his symphonies. And I sat next to a lady and we started yakking. And as it turned out, she was Arthur Rubinstein's niece. She's a friend of the society. Lou, I don't even know if she's still with us, if she's still alive. But she befriended me and I asked her, would you mind? Oh, and she said to me that she's very close to Lagrange, Henri Lagrange. Can you pronounce his name for me, please?
Lagrange.
All right.
Yeah, it's
Lagrange.
fine. I mean, not the French.
She made it clear that she was very close to him. So I asked her, I said, you know what, I just finished writing an article, and I have a lot of analysis that goes along with it, Schenkerian analysis, other kinds of analysis that goes along with that article. Since you are so close to him, would you consider sending my article and my analyses to him? She said, I'd be glad to do that. She did it. And he wrote back. He wrote back to me, and you know what he asked me? He said, Mr. Horton, did Mahler here abide with me in England for the first time when he traveled to England? I couldn't answer that question. I didn't know. But the point that drew me to in the Mahler Companion, Stephen Heffling wrote in a footnote that the whole matter of where he heard it for the first time can't be argued because Abide With Me was published 60 million times by 1912. And what does that mean? It means that it's probable, in my mind anyway, that the answer to Maestro Lagrange's question was, he may have heard it in England, but the report that was given was that when he was in the Majestic Hotel above Central Park, and there was that funeral for that fire captain, and Abide With Me was played as a part of that funeral service, that possibly, not definitely, but quite possibly, was where he first heard that hymn. Someone saying something?
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Please.
It's always frustrating for a guy like me to sit here, not wanting to interrupt the flow of the discussion, but just for factual, certain
Clarity?
information, and not just clarity. There is no evidence that Mahler ever heard Abide With Me as such, that he identified the title with what he heard. He may have heard the hymn, After Oh My God. And well, you're right, it was very popular. But there has been no evidence to indicate that he knew enough about what he heard to relate the ninth's opening or any other part of the finale with any part of Abide With Me. That's not the magic, if I may say. That's not what makes it important, what you did. And that you are the one who drew attention to something that was known. It was known, folks. Everybody who listened to the ninth, the critics from the beginning, I think I may have a 1912 review, knew the connection from the opening bars of the finale with Abide With Me. Not because it was a religious hymn, but they knew it because they knew Abide With Me, not because Mahler knew it was Abide With Me. And we don't have that evidence, see?
I take your point.
I will say one more thing, I'll be quiet.
I understand.
There is something very important to justify what you did, that you should know, that connects Mahler, well, in an ironic way with Nietzsche, but in a literary way, and the Abide With Me question. And that is, to my mind, and I've written on this, Mahler was a motivic composer. He listened to something, and if he thought it had meaning to him from somewhere else, he might use it in his own music. Some of it. Hint of it, often extraordinarily frequently. That, as you proved, happened with Abide With Me. Somehow or another, that phrase lit him up. Because it's not just the ninth. I mean, there are other earlier symphonies where hints of this same phrase appear. We don't know whether there is an identification between the earlier and the ninth. But what we do know is that they're there. One can say, there is something you can identify with. That's the way Mahler wrote a lot of his music. There are identification figures and phrases, gestures, topoi, that he used. Unearthing them along with, if you will, this Abide With Me reference only gives greater weight to what I believe strongly is his motivic penchant for writing melodic line.
My response, sir, is that in 7 years of research and study, I did, and my ability to trace that hymn note for note for note in the substructure of the finale, where every single note in that hymn is traceable to some section of the orchestra. Somebody's playing that, and it is just true. But that's why I'm doing a dissertation, because who knows? That's why I'm doing a dissertation. It means that much to me. He was reviled, and the text of that hymn speaks to his resolution of having been reviled, to my mind, after 40 years of being in church music ministry.
See, that's another point, give me one more little shot. That's another point of connection between Mahler and Nietzsche. They both had a proclivity for identifying with something extra musical or unrelated to the context of the music they were writing or the work they were writing. Nietzsche does it all the time. You can point to figures and phrases from Zarathustra, doesn't really matter, that appear earlier in actually similar contexts that connect the two. Then comes the fun. That's the fun you experience. Now, how do they get this? Why do they get this connection? And comes possibly a lifetime. With Mahler, it's multiple lifetimes because there are so many figures musically that have this connection. So, if you want to talk about Abide With Me as a motive, argument notwithstanding, you can draw on that line and parallel it with the way that Nietzsche wrote much of his special effects in his work.
This is a conversation that I'm sure will and could continue for quite some time. Just to bring it back to the book, I just wanted, Jeremy, you look like maybe you want to say something, but I also wanted to.
No, yeah, respond to that if there's time.
I don't know either the hymn or the deep tracing of the hymn in the ninth the way Randall does. So I don't have anything to say to that, but I did want to give anyone a chance to ask a question if they had questions after we've had our time to chat. I'm happy to answer anything about sort of the book process as well if there are questions. I mean, I know that there are students in the audience, so undertaking a big research project, maybe there are questions about that, but yeah, I just wanted to give the opportunity.
Thanks for the talk and the discussion. It's been really great. I am interested about your process, Professor Batstone, with particularly going through all the libraries over those 10 months and crafting your narrative using those resources and using facts, but also using your scholarly ability to really detail the narrative that came out of that adventure over those 10 months.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. I mean, I definitely think there is always a danger in research with seeking what you are finding what you are seeking, so to speak. And so really needing to kind of protect yourself against that as much as you can. And I think we're all human and we're drawn to certain things for reasons that are personal. But when I went to look at these sources, I did go with the idea of not, I couldn't see them from anywhere but Vienna. I don't know if at this point it would be possible to see them digitally, but I needed to go and look at them in person, and the Fulbright program is very good about allowing for those kinds of research trips. But I definitely knew that there were these writings about Nietzsche. I didn't know what was in them. And so going as much as possible with an open mind to say, what are these writers saying about Nietzsche, and is there any continuity? So I spent a lot of time just taking notes on all of these different essays mostly, and there were definitely some outliers. I mean, there were people who objected to Nietzsche, there were people who sort of wrote off the intellectual groups that were Nietzsche enthusiasts as being sort of silly, and they didn't understand Nietzsche, or Nietzsche wasn't important. But overall, I suppose in some ways I was lucky that there was a kind of continuity, and that there had been some work done on some of the other figures, not necessarily on Mahler, but on some of the other figures and their readings of Nietzsche. But it's sort of a science and an art, I suppose. And yeah, I hope that I think that I treated the sources fairly and didn't sort of bring too much to them that wasn't just there to be seen and to be read. But you can have opportunities in research where you go to look at these sources and nothing emerges, or what emerges is not, it doesn't have a kind of continuity that you can then work with. And at least in this case, there was something there. But it took a long time. I mean, I was there it was an academic year, and it wasn't really until the end of the year that I had the chance to visit, like I said, it was about half a dozen libraries, copy things out, translate them. I mean, everything, of course, was written in German, and to sort of start to get a sense of a kind of continuity, and then a continuity with what I thought Mahler was doing. But yeah, I would say in some ways I was lucky that the sources came together in that way, and they don't always. But I think trying to find the items that, clearly on the face of their descriptions or their titles speak to the subject, and then trying to approach those items as objectively, well, each is subjective, as objectively as possible, and, see what comes, and to embrace the idea, I think, that even if what comes is contradictory, that's also okay. I often, when I'm teaching sort of research methods courses, try to encourage students not to necessarily give up on a project because they can't find the information that they're looking for, but sometimes the fact that you can't find it is in itself an interesting element of the research. And so that kind of mindset of what is on the page, and whatever it is, it's going to be interesting, and what does it tell me? And in this instance, there was a story to be told that sort of mostly everyone fit together. But like I said, there were a few, and I do mention in parts of the book essays where people were very dismissive of Nietzsche who were in Mahler's circle. So, I mean, for the sake of the presentation, I've certainly made it maybe seem more perfectly cohesive than it was. But I do think that this group, they did have a particular reception, and that was traceable in their writings. It's not traceable in Mahler's writings. If you just look at what Mahler wrote, it's very unclear. But looking at, okay, these are the people who were talking to Mahler about Nietzsche, I think then you can start to sort of, from there, build out a way of thinking about the subject that has roots in research, but also offers, an interpretation. And that, of course, is what this is, and it's by no means the only interpretation of Mahler or of Nietzsche.
The first quote that you had in the slides.
Yeah.
What year was that, and where is that in relationship to the composition of the 4 symphonies?
Yeah, so that was 1891. So it was right around the beginning of these. So the first symphony was written between 88 and 90. So it was sort of right around that time period. And there are other instances where, friends of Mahler are talking about being on vacation with him in the 80s and 90s and are like, Mahler's reading Das Knaben Wunderhorn and Nietzsche with his morning cigarette. So there are these, breadcrumbs in the history that, I also think line up quite well with these earlier symphonies. And even though we do have copies of Mahler's own library where you can see kind of annotations that he's made and everything that he owned, and that includes things after 1900, I think, yeah, I mean, this was sort of what was available, and what was available was that this group that was very influential early in Mahler's career had this particular reading, and you know, you go through life and big things happen, and your worldview maybe changes, maybe not, you know, that sort of.
At the Prentice-Dorfer?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I thank you all for coming, for your interest. The book is in the Hunter Library if you are interested. And I thank my discussants very much for their time and interest in the subject and in talking with me today. So.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. Trouble for that.
Somewhere here?